Hey guys, Christine here, a designer here at ZURB. Welcome to our Foundation CSS tutorial. In this 5-part series, you'll learn all about the basics of CSS, how to write it, and how you can write on top of our custom Foundation components. Whether you're brand new to CSS or you're just brushing up on your styling chops, we're going to walk through this step by step. In this lesson, you'll learn all about CSS selectors, properties, and something called the CSS box model. Let's get started. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. These are basically the instructions that tell the browser how our HTML is displayed on the browser and other media. To keep your HTML markup as clean as possible, you always want to create an external CSS file, and that's where all of your styles will live. This way, whenever you need to change the look of your site, it can be done just by changing things in this single file. So here's an example of not this one, of a CSS file from our Foundation stack. So I just newly downloaded Foundation onto my computer, and this is the default, just the CSS version. And CSS looks something like this. In our Foundation's CSS file, there's like a bunch of different styles in here, and we're doing a bunch of different things to define styles of broad components. So in this particular file, it's pretty, it can look pretty confusing for a beginner. So today we're going to teach you how to write your own CSS from scratch and how to link it up in your own project files. So an external CSS file usually will live in a CSS folder, and the way that we name it, the file is, it will be like your CSS file name .css. So the extension .css is what's going to turn this file into a cascading style sheet, and that's how the browser will know to look for this file in order to apply styles to your page. So first, let's link up, take a look at how we link up this CSS page. So this is just the default Foundation index.html page. We're going to ignore all this stuff at the bottom. We're actually taking a look at what's in the head tags here. So we always link up our CSS files between our head tags. So the way that we link it is with this tag, link, and then we do a rel style sheet, and then we link it to wherever this CSS file is in our project folder. So this particular CSS file lives in a folder called CSS, and then the CSS file is named app.css. We're also linking up the foundation.css because that's where all of our Foundation components live. So how do we write CSS? I'm going to move into CodePen for our examples because it's easier to see the actual changes happening to our code while I'm writing the CSS. But CSS rules are essentially made up of selectors and declarations. A selector tells the browser what element we're trying to apply styles to, and the declaration is what defines that style. So, for example, let's put some HTML in here. Let's do a p tag, text. All right, so now I'm going to style this text. I'm actually going to add some padding here just so that we can see this a little bit better. Okay, so in order to style this p tag, this text, I have to use a selector and reference something in this HTML. So here I have, I'm just going to target it with p. That's the tag that I'm using, and then for CSS, we always write our CSS rules inside of these curly brackets here. And then inside of those brackets, we type in all of our CSS declarations. So for example, let's do color blue. and that changed our text blue. So let's just talk about the syntax of this a little bit. I've chosen P as my selector. So this is how the CSS file is targeting my HTML. And then inside I have a declaration. So this entire line here is called a declaration. And the declaration is made up of two parts. The property, which is this color colon here, and then the value. So all properties need to be followed by a value because that's how you're defining what the property is. And then at the end of our declaration, we always end it with a semicolon here. So this is how we write CSS.
Hey there, K-Ball here from ZURB. I hope you're enjoying Christine's lesson and we'll get right back to it. But first I want to let you know about an awesome opportunity. If you want to develop like a pro, you really should be using a front-end framework. ZURB's open source foundation framework is used by millions of developers to 10x their productivity and deliver professional websites. And we have an opportunity for you to learn from the core team who built it. Click the link right up there to learn about our next live webinar where you'll be able to ask questions to the core team, learn about the entire framework, and go from zero to website in no time flat. Check it out. And now back to Christine.
We can have multiple declarations in here. For example, I can use the property font size, 16 pixels. No, maybe that's already 16 pixels. Let's do 25 pixels. Okay. So in a CSS block, you can have essentially as many CSS declarations in here as you want, and then this will style whatever. All of these like declarations in here will be styling whatever selector you're targeting. So when we're writing CSS in an external file, in a separate file, that's called external CSS. But it is also possible to write CSS inside of your HTML file. We typically don't want to do this when we move our projects into production. Usually this could be useful for when you're trying to quickly scaffold something and then you just want to add some quick styles to it to see what it looks like. You can do that in the HTML and maybe that speeds up your process. But in order to write some internal CSS in your HTML file, we write them in style tags. So style tag looks like this. And then inside of this style tag, we write our CSS. And CSS in HTML looks exactly like what you would write in an external CSS file. So I'm just going to write P color red. And that applies the style just like it would if this were written in a CSS file. Another thing that you can do is instead of writing your styles in a style tag, you can also write them inline in your actual HTML element with a style attribute. So an attribute is something that lives within the HTML tag, and we just start with style, and then we write in our CSS declarations in here. So in here we don't like use any of these curly brackets or selectors because it already knows you're trying to apply the style to this tag. So I'm gonna write color green. I still need the semicolon to end my declaration. And there you go. That's called inline CSS because it's written directly in the same line as your HTML. All right, so now that we know how to write CSS, let's talk a little bit about selectors. So these things right here, and the different types of selectors there are. So this selector here, this is called a tag selector or a type selector. This targets an HTML tag directly. There's also something called a class selector. So this is when you're selecting a class that you've applied to an HTML element. So, and the way that we call a class selector is we use the period and then we write the class name. So I'm going to use this class and then we write our CSS as normal have our declarations in here. Let's try font weight bold. So this is just a different way of referencing our HTML. And there are reasons why we use different selectors. This is something that we're going to go over in our next lesson when we talk about specificity. But here, we just want to talk about the different types of selectors. There's also another selector called an ID selector. So an ID is if you had an ID in this p tag. Let's call it paragraph. You would call that ID in your CSS with the pound sign and then the ID name. These are just a couple of properties that I'm throwing in here, but that's basically how you use different types of selectors. So IDs are used with the pound sign. Classes are used with the period, and then tags, you just simply type in the tag. So in CSS, in order to style all of your elements, there's a ton of different properties that you can use. So text transform, font weight, color, font size, these are all just a couple of properties that you can use to style text. There's like a ton of things that you can do. What would be useful is you can simply search for like CSS properties. And usually W3 Schools is a great reference for this. They have like they have instructions on how to use different types of properties and what values you can input for all of those properties. But for today, we're just going to talk about a couple of some really important ones. So the first one I'm going to be talking about is the display property. And the display property is responsible for controlling the layout of an element. So just to illustrate what this does, what the display property does, I'm going to write a couple of links in here. So in CodePen, you can do this thing where you just type in the tag name or a class name and then press tab, and then it'll create that tag for you. So that's super useful for when you're writing code. It makes it a lot faster. Just thought I'd mention that in case anyone was wondering how I'm doing this. I'm just going to copy and paste this. I'm just going to target these links and then write display. And then the first value that I'm going to use is block. So you can see how that affected these links. Display block will always turn these elements into blocks, and they'll attempt to be full width, and it always starts on a new line. So that's what this did here. So I'm going to inspect this just so that you guys can see what's actually happening with the code here. Let's see if I can fit this in here. All right. So this link now is actually full width. That's what display block did. It made it span the entire width like that's available. And now it's sitting one on top of the other because that's what display block does. Another value that you can use with display is inline. So it doesn't look like it's done much, but what it's doing here is it makes our elements sit on the same line as each other. And it also allows it to only take up as much space as it needs. Another value that we can use is inline block. So this didn't change anything visually, but what inline block does is it turns our elements into blocks, but they also attempt to sit in line with each other. So what this does is now that these links are blocks, I can apply a width and height to it. So I can say 100 pixels. And now I can apply a width and height to this. But if this was just inline, I would not be able to do that. See, now my width and height aren't applying because it's an inline item. Another value that we can use with display is none. So what this does is it actually hides your elements from view, and in the HTML is actually removing this A tag so that we can't see it anymore. And lastly, you can use something called flex as a display value. Flex is a new display mode for CSS3, and you actually wouldn't typically apply display flex to a link item. Usually you would apply flex to a container. So let's create a div and then put all of our links in here. And then now I'm going to target the div and set it to display flex. So what that did is it actually made all of our items turn into flex items. So these links are now flex items inside of this this flex container. They sit side by side from each other, and now we can actually apply different flex properties to this div in order to manipulate the positioning and placement of everything inside of it. So we're not going to go too much into display flex right now. That's probably a whole other tutorial by itself. But just as an example, we can do something like justify content space. And then that actually made all of our links share the same space in between each other. And that's kind of what Flexbox does. It allows you to manipulate items inside of flex containers to position them a lot easier. So the next property we're going to talk about is the background property. This is a very, very common property that you'll probably use a lot. And typically you'll see like the shorthand of the background property. So that would look something like this. And then inside of it, you might have a hex code that's defining the color of your background. So that changed the color of my background to this gray color. And then you'll also see, like you might see a URL in here, and then that will link to an image. I'm just gonna put a random URL in here. It doesn't actually exist, but just to show you guys what it looks like. And then after that, you might see like a no repeat or something like that. And what this will do is it's defining the background, how the background is repeating. So if you had an image in here and it wasn't big enough to fill the size of your container, it would just repeat the image. And if you say no repeat, then it won't repeat the image. And then you'll also see something like center. And if you had an image in here, it would actually position the background image according to whatever these values are. So this is a shorthand for background, and these are all defining different properties. So if I were to write this out, if I were to take it out of shorthand and write it completely, it would look something like this. We can do background color. And then that would do the exact same thing as that previous shorthand property. I can do background image, and that would be some image. I'm just gonna go to placehold it. So hopefully this helps us see what these properties are doing. Make it a little bit taller so that you guys can see. All right, so this is our image. This is a placeholder image with some text in there. And then we'll also do background repeat. And then if I say no repeat, then it will stop the image from repeating. You can also, the default value is always repeat. So you can either have repeat or no repeat in here. You can also have background attachment. And then the different values here are scroll. So if you use background attachment scroll, this background will scroll as you scroll down the page. So like it's doing here. You can also do fixed. So this actually fixes the background image to one spot. So now as I'm scrolling, it doesn't actually scroll with like the top of the div. Next, we can do background position. And then usually the background position values, we'll put in 2 values. So we can do center, top. And then you can see how that kind of changes the position of the background. I can do let's do right top. And that just moves that image around. So that's how you can style your background and do different things with it to get it to look the way that you want. So something to note about the background property is if you have an image, a background image defined, it will always take precedence over the color. So as you can see, I've defined both. I've defined the color and an image, and it's actually using both because my div is so big that you can see past the image, and it's going to use this background color to take the rest of that space if the image can't fill the space. So the next thing that we're going to cover is something called the CSS box model. This is one of the most important concepts to nail down because in order to fully understand how to properly style a layout with CSS, you need to get familiar with this concept. So essentially, the box model treats everything in HTML like a rectangular box that's taking up space on your page. So the CSS box model is laying out how these boxes are sized. And once you have a good grasp of this concept, it's a lot easier to visualize your layout in code because then you'd have a better understanding of how each element is taking up space on the page. So of course, the amount of space that an element is taking up on the page is important to how you're going to lay out all of these elements next to each other. So there are 4 main parts to your box model. The first is content, and that's content that's living within your box. In this case, my box is a div, and the content is all of this text inside of it. Content doesn't have to be just text. It's literally anything inside of that container. That's your content. So it can be a link, it can be a button, it could be an image. So basically anything inside of your box is the content of this box. And then the next part is padding. So padding is kind of a transparent space between like the border of your content or the border of your container and your content. And then the third part is the border, which is this black line around my content. And then the fourth part is margin. So margin is basically spacing that's all around your container. So to visualize this a little bit better, I'm going to inspect it. So the Chrome inspector comes with this really useful tool where it's actually laying out the box model for me. This is not to scale, it's just showing you every part of the box model and the size of each of these components. So in the middle we have our content, and this is kind of defining like the initial size of our box basically, because we're not defining a width or anything. It's just going to change as our content, like as my screen gets wider or smaller. And that's okay. And then outside of our content, we have our padding. So that's that green highlight right there. And that's 10 pixels wide. And then next to that, we have a border, which is 3 pixels wide. And then outside of all of that, we have a 50 pixel margin. So all of these put together is what's making up the size of our box. So now that you have an understanding of how these different things are affecting the size of our HTML elements, I want to talk a little bit more about the CSS syntax. Sometimes you'll see something, you'll see some complicated looking CSS, and it might look something like this, where you have a div, P, H1, and then inside of it you have a bunch of CSS declarations. We do this a lot in our Foundation CSS file. So that's this is how we define styles for multiple HTML elements at once. So this is called grouping. So in order to group your CSS, we would write our selectors and then separate them by commas. And then inside of there, we would write CSS declarations. And then what this will do is it actually applies all of this CSS to all of these selectors. So if I had a paragraph tag in here, and then if I had an H1 tag in here, so it's applying all of these styles to all of these tags, because that's how I've defined it in my CSS block. So if I had like an H2 in here, this CSS isn't going to affect that because I haven't selected it in this group. So grouping makes it a lot easier to write CSS and apply them to a bunch of different selectors. If we didn't group, that means we would have to write the same CSS over and over and then apply them to different selectors. So this kind of speeds up the process and allows you to apply multiple or apply styles to multiple elements. Another thing you can do in CSS is nest elements in your CSS. So what this does is it allows you to apply styles to selectors within other selectors. So for example, here I have an unordered list and then several list items inside of it. I can use CSS to target these list items directly without using a class or an ID. So in order to do this, I'm going to write UL space LI, and then I'm going to open my curly brackets, and then I'm going to write some CSS in here. And there it goes. You can actually specify different selectors within other selectors. And this kind of helps you remove some markup from your HTML. I didn't have to, in order to target this list item, I didn't have to apply a class to it or anything. I'm simply selecting the parent element, which is this unordered list. This is the parent element, and then selected the child element inside of it, which is this li right here. So I didn't actually have to create a class and apply them to this list element. All I had to do was select the UL and refer to the li inside of that UL. And in this structure, this list item is a descendant of this unordered list. There are lots of different ways that you can target different items in your HTML. CSS comes with many different types of selectors. Besides the class selectors, the tag selectors, and the ID selectors, there are several different advanced selectors that you can use in your CSS to target something more specifically. So one of these advanced selectors is the universal selector, and the universal selector will select everything in your HTML. To use this selector, we use the asterisk, and basically what the asterisk is targeting is literally everything in your HTML. So let's just, I'm gonna add another tag in here to make this a better example for you guys. Find a paragraph. Okay, now I'm going to set this background to green. So what this did is it selected everything in my HTML, the UL, the paragraph, and basically the entire body, and set the background to green. I can also nest this selector inside of another selector. So if I did UL space asterisk, so now it's only selecting everything inside of my UL and setting the background of those items to green. So this isn't a very common selector to use. It can simplify your CSS writing a little bit depending on how you use it, but I typically don't really see this very often unless you're really trying to like get to deep into some specific tag that you're trying to style. This is a way that you can target your HTML elements more specifically is with something called an attribute selector. So an attribute selector will target an HTML element based on its attributes. An attribute is something that lives inside of your HTML tags. For example, an input is a very common form element that also has a couple of attributes that you can use. So in our CSS, I'm going to target this input based on the attribute. And then I'm also going to write another input here. All right, so these are both inputs. One has a type attribute, one does not. So now I'm going to target this input. So I'm going to target it by typing in input type text. And the attribute is actually living within these hard brackets here. And then let's do border 30 pixels solid red. So I was able to target this input very specifically based on the attribute that it has. And this other input is just still looking normal, doesn't have any styles applied to it because it did not select this input. It did not select this input because it didn't have this attribute in it. So another type of selector that we can use are called combinator selectors. So these are different symbols that we can use in our CSS in order to target different types of elements that are nested inside of other elements. So for example, a child selector. A child of an element is basically anything that is nested inside of another element. So in this example here, this unordered list is the parent of the list item, and the list item is the child of this unordered list. So I can target these list items by typing in UL and then with this greater than sign, LI, color red. So here I'm saying I want to target this unordered list and I want to target the child, the list item inside of the unordered list. So another combinator selector is something called the adjacent sibling selector. And what this does is it will target a sibling of the selector that you're specifying. So just in this example, I threw together like a quick, some quick code up here. We have a div with some paragraphs inside of it, and then immediately following that, we have some more paragraph text. So I'm going to target this paragraph based on its association with this div up here. So to do that, I'm going to target the adjacent sibling of the div. So I'm going to write div plus p, and then I'm going to change the text color to red. So here I'm selecting div first, and then I'm selecting the adjacent sibling with this plus sign. So div plus p, that's targeting the adjacent sibling of the div, which is this paragraph right here. So another selector is the general sibling selector. So this general sibling selector is not as picky as this adjacent sibling selector. An adjacent sibling is an element that is directly after an element. So the reason that the adjacent sibling selector only targeted this p tag and not this last p tag is because it's only targeting the sibling that comes directly after the div. So the general sibling selector will actually select any sibling that's after the div. So if I write div and then the squiggly p, and then write color, I'm going to delete this so that we can see what's happening. Color blue. So now it's actually targeting all the siblings of this div, which are these two paragraphs. So these are just some of the selectors that we can use to more specifically target some HTML elements. But aside from actually targeting like classes and tags, we can actually target states of an element. So for example, a hover state, an active state, a focus state. These are all targetable things. So what I mean by a hover state is, I'm gonna write a link here. And so if I scroll my mouse over this link here, you can't really see it, but it actually has a very slight styling that happens. When I hover over it, the link gets a little bit darker. So this is called the hover state. And we can actually target that hover state and control the interaction that occurs when I put my mouse over my link. So to target a hover state, I need to first select this anchor tag, and then I'm going to target the hover state with :hover. So this is called a pseudo class. All pseudo classes start with a colon and then the state that you're trying to target. So in this case, I'm trying to target the hover state. So now I'm going to write font weight bold. And now when I hover over this link, it's changing the style based on the hover that's happening. There are several different pseudo classes that you can use to target different states. You can target the focus state of an input element. So for example, input. And now I'm going to target the focus state of this input. So a focus state is basically the state of this input when I click into it. So to target this, I'm going to type in my selector. And then let's do border 1 pixel. So now when I click into, oh, I did not select the focus state. So to select the focus state, I need to do :focus. And then now when I click into this input field, the border is blue. But that only happens when I click into it, not when I'm clicked out of it, because it's only selecting the focus state and styling that state. You can also target elements with something called a pseudo element. So a pseudo element is different from a pseudo class in that a pseudo element is targeting something that doesn't actually exist yet in your HTML. So for this, you can use something like the before and after pseudo element. And for example, I'm going to target this anchor tag and then write a colon before. And then what this will do is it's going to target kind of the area before this anchor tag, and I can actually style that. So a very common use for this pseudo element is to insert like an icon or an image or something right before an element. So I'm going to do that, I'm going to use the property content, and this is going to allow me to add content before my anchor tag. I'm going to add a URL, and then I'm going to paste an image in here. Oh, my link is wrong. Okay. So this is a little bit too big, but this is basically what the before element does. So I've targeted the space right before my link, and I've inserted some content into it. And this content, it doesn't have to be a URL, it can be text. So in order to add like a string in here, you want to surround it with single quotations. So, and it actually added stuff right before my link based on the thing that I defined in my CSS. The same thing happens when you target after, except it's going to come after this link. So this is just an example of how you can implement these pseudo elements. It can be really useful for things like menu links. If you wanted to include like a nice icon right before the link, this is how you could do it. You can even style this a little bit. I believe padding works if you do like 5-pixel padding. And that actually added some padding here. Let's just make it bigger so that you guys can see it. So you can actually style this element after the link, even though it's not actually in your HTML. Awesome! You just learned how to write some basic CSS and how to effectively target your HTML elements with selectors. If you had any questions about something that I mentioned today, feel free to leave a comment down below. Next week, we'll dive deeper into specificity in CSS and what the cascade is actually doing. To learn more about Foundation from the people who built it, feel free to check out the link below for our Intro to Foundation course. In this webinar, you'll learn all about Foundation and its components and how to use them. Make sure you don't miss our next lesson by clicking subscribe, and our Yeti can get some ice cream. It's been pretty hot these days. See you guys next week.